They dragged the mountain man down in iron chains and gave him two choices: the hangman's rope or a wedding ring. He chose the ring. The town thought they were handing their unwanted spinster over to a beast. They were wrong. What she did next terrified them all. The jailhouse smelled of sulfur, spilled chamber pots, and the sickly sweet vanilla of Mayor Taggart's imported cigars. Roan sat on the splintered pine bench, his wrists rubbed raw by the heavy iron cuffs. Blood had dried in a crusty, rust-colored line down his forearm. He didn't rub the wound. He just watched the mayor pace the cramped, windowless room. "You trapped beaver on town-deeded water, Roan," Taggart said. The man's belly strained against the buttons of a checkered wool vest. "That's poaching. Men swing for poaching." Roan said nothing. His jaw ground tight, teeth scraping together until a dull ache shot up behind his ears. The air down here in the valley was too thick. It tasted like dust and unwashed bodies. He wanted the high ridges. He wanted the thin, biting wind of the bitter roots that froze the sweat to a man's neck. "But I am a Christian man," Taggart continued, pausing to flick gray ash onto the dirt floor. "And I have a problem. You have a problem. We can fix both." The problem was Taggart's sister, Hester. Roan had seen her exactly twice in his 5 years of trading pelts in the settlement. She was 36, a ghost of a woman who bought flour in bulk and never spoke to the gossiping hens by the general store. The town called her the Old Maid. They said her womb was barren, her temper sour, and her face too hard to look at before breakfast. More importantly, she sat on 300 acres of prime grazing land left by her fatherland she legally retained as long as she was an unwed dependent of the estate, or until she married. Taggart wanted the land. He needed a husband who would take her far away, or better yet, break her spirit enough that she'd sign the deed over to her brother just to escape. He needed a brute. He looked at Roan, a man who smelled of pine pitch, dried blood, and old leather, a man who hadn't cut his hair in 2 years, and saw the perfect monster. "You marry Hester," Taggart said, leaning in close enough that Roan could smell the stale whiskey on his breath. "You take her up to that miserable cabin of hers on the ridge. You keep her out of my town. Do that, and the poaching charges disappear." Roan looked at the iron cuffs. Then he looked at the iron bars of the cell. He didn't want a wife. He barely tolerated the company of his own mules. But a rope was a final thing. "Take the cuffs off," Roan rasped. His voice sounded like two stones grating together. 3 hours later, he was standing in the town's drafty Methodist church. The floorboards sagged under his boots. Someone had forced him into a borrowed cotton shirt that pinched his broad shoulders and smelled faintly of mothballs. Then Hester walked in. There was no music, no gasps of admiration, just the hollow times, thud-thud times of her sensible, mud-caked boots against the wood. She didn't wear white. She wore a dress the color of bruised plums, patched at the elbows. Her hair was the dull yellow of winter straw, pulled back so tight it drew the corners of her eyes into a permanent, severe squint. Roan watched her approach. He expected fear. He expected a woman weeping into a handkerchief, terrified of the giant, feral man she was being chained to. But as Hester stopped beside him, she didn't tremble. She smelled of lye soap, dried sage, and something metallic like a whetstone. She didn't look up at him. She stared straight ahead at the preacher. "Dearly beloved," the preacher began, his voice rushing through the words as if eager to scrub his hands of the whole affair. The congregation, mostly Taggart's associates, and a few morbidly curious townsfolk, sat in dead silence. Roan felt the sweat pool at the base of his spine. The walls of the church felt like a trap closing. He looked down at Hester's hands as they were instructed to join them. Her knuckles were swollen, the skin across the back of her hands mapped with pale, thin scars from an axe or a skinning knife. When his rough, calloused fingers closed over hers, he felt the rigid, unyielding muscle beneath her skin. She didn't flinch at his touch. She just gripped his hand back, hard enough that her fingernails dug into his palm. "I do," he grunted when prompted. "I do," she replied. Her voice was flat, devoid of any tremble or joy. It sounded like a business transaction. Taggart smirked from the front pew. The papers were signed in black ink that bled into the cheap parchment. Roan was no longer a condemned man. He was a husband. And as they walked out of the church, the heavy wooden doors groaning shut behind them, Roan felt the crushing weight of a different kind of shackle. The wagon ride to Hester's homestead took 4 hours. The silence between them was heavier than the cast iron stove strapped to the back of the buckboard. The only sounds were the rhythmic, wet thud of the mule's hooves in the muddy ruts and the constant, irritating squeak of the front left wheel axle. Roan held the reins. The cold November wind began to bite as they climbed elevation, whipping through the thin cotton shirt he still wore. He noticed Hester shivering out of the corner of his eye. She had her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. He reached back with one hand, grabbed a heavy, moth-eaten wool blanket from his pack, and tossed it into her lap. She looked at the blanket, then up at him. Her eyes were the dull, flat gray of a frozen horse trough. "I didn't ask for that," she said. "Didn't say you did," Roan muttered, snapping the reins over the mule's rump. "But if you freeze to death on the wagon, Taggart'll try to hang me for murder instead of poaching." She didn't argue. She pulled the blanket over her shoulders, burying her chin in the rough wool. They arrived at the homestead just as the sun bled out behind the western ridge, leaving the sky a bruised purple. The cabin was small, but surprisingly solid. The logs were chinked tight with mud and horsehair, and a steady stream of gray smoke drifted from the stone chimney. Someone, likely a hired hand, had kept the fire going. Roan unhitched the mule, his hands working mechanically, his mind racing. What was he supposed to do now? He had spent the last decade sleeping under stars or in hastily dug snow caves. The thought of stepping into a confined room with a strange woman playing house made his chest tighten with a sudden suffocating panic. He considered just walking off into the timber right then. Let Taggart hunt him. Let the old maid fend for herself. But he needed his rifles and his traps. Taggart had confiscated them, promising to send them up with a rider by the end of the week. He was trapped here, for now. He pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped inside. The cabin was suffocatingly warm. It smelled of old grease, dried apples hanging from the rafters, and the sharp tang of wood smoke. There was one bed in the corner, covered in a faded quilt, one table, 2 chairs. Hester walked past him, stripping off her wool coat and hanging it on an iron nail by the door. She didn't pause to let the awkwardness settle. She walked straight to the hearth, grabbed an iron poker, and jabbed at the dying embers. "There's beans in the pot from yesterday," she said, her back to him. "Pork fat in the pan. Eat if you're hungry. Or don't." Roan stood by the door, his massive frame making the small room feel even tighter. "Where do you want me?" he asked. The words felt foreign on his tongue. Hester turned. She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since the jailhouse. She took in his tangled beard, the dirt caked into the creases of his neck, the sheer, imposing width of him. She didn't back away. She pointed to the woven rag rug in front of the hearth. "You sleep there. I sleep in the bed." Roan raised an eyebrow. "Taggart thinks I'm up here to break you like a wild horse." "Taggart is an idiot who thinks the world operates strictly on force," Hester replied, her voice steady. She walked over to the wooden table, grabbed a tin plate, and ladled a heavy scoop of beans onto it. She set it down with a loud clatter. "You are here because my brother needs my land, and a married woman surrenders her property rights to her husband in this county. He expects you to beat me until I sign the transfer over to him, at which point he will pay you off and you can go back to the dirt you came from." Roan stared at her. "And what do you expect me to do?" "I expect you to stay out of my way," she said, meeting his gaze. "I expect you to chop wood, because my right shoulder is giving out. I expect you to sit on that porch when Taggart's men ride up to check on us, and I expect you to look terrifying enough to make them turn around." She wasn't a victim. The realization hit Roan like a physical blow. She wasn't an old maid who had been forced into this against her will. She had let it happen. She had traded her legal independence for a guard dog. A slow, rough noise rattled in Roan's chest. It took him a moment to realize it was a laugh. "You think I'm a dog you can whistle at, lady?" "I think you're a man who doesn't want to hang," Hester shot back. "We both have a noose around our necks, Roan. Mine is just made of paper." She pointed to the plate. "Eat the beans. Tomorrow, we fix the roof." Roan didn't sleep that night. He lay on the hard floor, listening to the wind howl against the logs. He listened to the steady, even breathing of the woman in the bed. She hadn't barricaded the door. She hadn't hidden a knife under her pillow, at least. Not that he saw. She had just gone to sleep. The sky was the color of dirty iron when he finally sat up. The fire had died down to a dull orange glow. He stood, his joints popping in the cold air, and walked toward the door. He needed space. He needed to smell the pines. He stepped out onto the porch, pulling the cold morning air deep into his lungs. A loud Times, cracked Times shattered the silence. Dirt kicked up violently just an inch from the toe of Roan's boot. He dropped to a crouch instantly, his hand flying to his empty hip where his revolver should have been. He scanned the tree line. Through the morning mist, two men on horseback sat at the edge of the clearing. Taggart's men. One of them held a smoking Winchester rifle. "Morning, Roan," the man shouted, a cruel laugh carrying over the frost-covered grass. "Mayor sent us to see if the bride survived her wedding night, or if you need us to cart off the body." Roan's muscles coiled. He was unarmed. He was dead. Suddenly, the heavy cabin door swung open behind him. Hester stepped out onto the porch. She wasn't wearing a dress. She wore a man's canvas trousers and a heavy canvas coat. And pressed firmly against her right shoulder was a double-barreled 1-0 gauge shotgun. She didn't shout. She didn't issue a warning. She simply aimed high and pulled the front trigger. The blast was deafening. The kickback threw her back a half step, but she caught her footing instantly. A shower of buckshot shredded the pine branches directly above the riders' heads, sending a cascade of severed pine needles and bark raining down on them. The horses shrieked, rearing up violently. One rider was thrown into the mud, the other barely held on, fighting the reins. Roan stared at her, stunned. The smell of burnt black powder stung his nose. Hester calmly broke the action of the shotgun, pulling a fresh shell from her pocket and sliding it into the empty chamber with a sharp, metallic Times clack. "Tell my brother," Hester yelled, her voice cutting through the ringing in Roan's ears like a rusted saw blade, "that my husband is a light sleeper, and next time you wake him, I won't aim for the trees." She snapped the barrel shut. The two men didn't wait. They scrambled upright, spurred their panicked horses, and bolted back down the trail toward town. Silence rushed back into the clearing, save for the drifting smoke from the barrel. Hester lowered the gun. She didn't look triumphant. She looked annoyed. She turned her flat gray eyes to Roan, who was still crouched by the porch post. "The roof needs patching," she said, her chest heaving slightly from the adrenaline. "The ladder is behind the woodshed." She turned and walked back inside, leaving the door open. Roan stood up slowly. He looked at the buckshot-shredded trees, then at the open door of the cabin. The smell of boiling coffee drifted out, mixing with the sharp scent of the gunpowder. He ran a rough hand over his beard. Taggart had sent him up here to break a timid spinster. Roan suddenly realized he was the one who was outmatched. By late December, the cold was no longer just weather. It was a living, breathing thing inside the cabin. It crept up through the floorboards, curling around their ankles like a frozen snake. The wind screamed off the Bitterroot Ridge, driving snow like crushed glass against the mud chinking. Taggart never sent Roan's rifles or his traps. It was a siege. Taggart had blocked the lower trail, counting on the brutal Montana winter to starve the fight out of them. A man without a gun and a spinster with a dwindling root cellar wouldn't last until the spring thaw. Eventually, Taggart figured Roan would break her arm, force her to sign the deed over, and drag her down the mountain for a hot meal and his own freedom. Roan knelt in the snow outside the woodshed, his bare hands numb as he twisted a length of scavenged copper wire into a snare. His knuckles were cracked, the fissures weeping, thin lines of blood that froze almost instantly. He was a man accustomed to having his tools. Reduced to trapping snowshoe hares with scrap wire felt humiliating, like begging for scraps. He carried 3 stiff, frozen hares back into the cabin. The warmth hit him like a physical blow, smelling intensely of rendered pork fat, damp wool, and the sharp tang of lye. Hester sat by the hearth. The kerosene lamp cast deep, hollow shadows under her cheekbones. The bruising purple bags under her flat gray eyes told him she wasn't sleeping, though she never complained. She was patching his canvas coat, her needle pulling the heavy twine through the fabric with a rhythmic, straining times shchk, shchk times sound. Roan dropped the hairs onto the scarred pine table. They hit the wood with a dull, heavy clatter. Hester didn't flinch. She tied off the thread, bit the end with her teeth to snap it, and set the coat aside. She stood, favoring her left leg. The cold had settled into her joints over the last month, making her walk stiff and jagged. She pulled a skinning knife from the block and went to work on the carcasses. Brother of yours is thorough, Rowan rasped, sinking into the chair opposite her. He rubbed his face, the grit of his own beard scratching his palms. Snows drifted 4 feet high in the lower pass. We ain't getting a wagon through, even if we wanted to. Hester ripped the hide off the first hair with a practiced, brutal jerk. He thinks my stomach will dictate my handwriting. Will it? Roan asked. She paused. The bloody knife hung suspended in the dim light. She looked up at him, her gaze cutting through the space between them. For a fraction of a second, the iron mask slipped. Roan saw the deep, trembling exhaustion beneath it. He saw the terrifying loneliness of a woman who had spent 36 years being treated as an obstacle, a joke, a piece of unwanted furniture blocking a gold mine. I will eat pine bark, Hester said quietly, her voice devoid of theatrics, vibrating with a raw, ugly truth. I will boil my leather boots. I will starve in this chair before I give that sweating, greedy pig the satisfaction of burying me. She resumed cutting. Roan watched her hands. They were ruined hands, rough, scarred, caked with dried blood and dirt. They weren't the soft, trembling hands of the saloon girls down in the valley, nor the delicate, gloved fingers of the mayor's wife. They were the hands of a survivor. Something shifted in Roan's chest, a strange, heavy settling. He had spent his entire life running from tethers, viewing people as traps meant to cage him. But this woman wasn't a cage. She was a trench. She was fighting the same war. He stood up. He walked over to the hearth, grabbed the blackened tin cup, and poured a measure of hot pine needle tea. He set it on the table right next to her skinning block. Drink, he grunted. Hester glanced at the cup, then at him. She didn't say thank you. She just wiped her bloody hand on her canvas apron, picked up the hot tin, and let the steam warm her face. Tomorrow, Roan said, staring at the frost creeping up the single window pane, I'll show you how to set a deadfall trap. Wires going to snap when the temperature drops further. All right, she said. It wasn't a declaration of love. It was a pact. The winter howled outside, beating against the walls, but inside the timber, the roots were taking hold. The thaw came late in March, turning the mountain into a treacherous slick of gray mud and slush. Taggart didn't wait for the roads to dry. He rode up the ridge with 3 men, their horses lathered and blowing hard, chests heaving in the thin air. Taggart wore a heavy buffalo coat, a cigar clamped between his teeth, looking every bit the victorious landlord coming to collect his due. In his saddlebag sat the transfer deed and an inkwell. He expected to find a frozen tomb, or, at the very least, a broken woman and a desperate mountain man, ready to trade her land for a plate of hot beef and a bottle of rye. They pulled into the clearing. The cabin was eerily quiet. No smoke drifted from the stone chimney. Looks like the cold did the work for us boys, Taggart sneered, spitting brown tobacco juice into the slush. Kick the door in. Let's see what's left. One of the hired guns, a heavy-set man named Jenkins, dismounted. He drew his revolver, boots squelching in the mud, and marched up the porch steps. He raised his boot to kick the latch. The heavy oak door swung open before his boot connected. Hester stood in the doorway. She was painfully thin, her cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass, her clothes hanging loose on her frame. But she stood perfectly straight, and the 1-0 gauge shotgun was resting comfortably against her hip, aimed directly at Jenkins' gut. Wipe your boots if you're coming inside, Jenkins, Hester said, her voice like cracked ice. I just swept. Jenkins froze, slowly raising his free hand. Taggart's horse shifted uneasily. The mayor pulled the cigar from his mouth, his face flushing a violent, mottled red. You crazy old bat! Put that away before I have you arrested for pointing a firearm at a deputy. You aren't the law up here, Arthur, Hester replied, stepping out onto the porch. The winter sun caught the gray in her dull yellow hair. You're trespassing. I hold the deed to this land as the executor of father's estate, Taggart bellowed, spurring his horse a few steps closer. You're an unwed woman. I was married last November, Hester interrupted. You arranged it. And under the law, the land transfers to the husband's name. Taggart barked a cruel, grating laugh. And where's your husband, Hester? Starved? Froze? Did the brute run off the minute the snow let up? He gestured to his men. Grab her. We'll find the paperwork. The 2 men on horseback reached for their Winchesters. A sound echoed from the tree line behind them. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a massive, sickening times, crack times of splintering wood. Taggart spun in his saddle just in time to see a 50-foot dead, standing pine crash directly across the narrow trail they had just ridden up, completely blocking their retreat. The ground shook. The horses screamed and reared. Before the snow dust could settle, Roan stepped out from the shadow of the timber. He didn't look like a starving man. He looked like the mountain itself had pulled free from its roots. He wore a heavy cloak of stitched wolf and rabbit pelts. In his right hand, he held a massive, double-bitted logging axe. He didn't rush them. He walked with a terrifying, measured stillness, his boots crunching heavily in the slush. The third rider raised his rifle, aiming at Roan's chest. Click-clack. The sharp, metallic racking of Hester's shotgun whipped the rider's attention back to the porch. She had the gun shouldered now, aimed right at Taggart's face. "Drop it," Roan rumbled. His voice carried across the clearing, low and gravelly, rattling in the chest of every man there. He stopped 10 feet from Taggart's horse. He looked at the mayor, his dark eyes burning with a quiet, lethal promise. "You forgot my traps, Arthur." Taggart's hands trembled on the reins. He looked at Roan, massive and feral, blocking the trail. He looked at his sister, skeletal but unyielding on the porch. He realized, with a sudden sinking terror, that he hadn't forced a helpless woman to marry a beast. He had locked 2 wolves in a cage together, and now they were both looking at him. "You don't want this fight, Roan," Taggart stammered, sweating despite the cold. "You shoot a mayor. You hang. I can have the poaching charges reinstated." "I ain't shooting anybody," Roan said, resting the heavy axe head on his shoulder. He nodded toward the porch. "My wife handles the firearms. I handle the firewood." Hester walked down the porch steps. She didn't lower the gun. "Take the paper out of your bag, Arthur." "Hester, listen to reason." "The quitclaim, Arthur," she said, stopping a few feet from his horse. "The one renouncing all rights to the estate boundary. Take it out, sign it, and leave." Taggart looked at Jenkins, who was still frozen on the steps, his hands raised. He looked at the tree blocking the trail, knowing it would take hours to hack through it. Trembling, he reached into his saddlebag, pulled out the parchment and a silver fountain pen. He laid it flat against his leather pommel, his hand shaking so violently he snapped the nib as he scrawled his signature. He let the paper drop into the mud. "You're dead," Taggart spat, looking between them. "Both of you. You'll starve out here." "We've eaten," Roan said flatly. "Now, get off our land." Taggart wrenched his horse around, shouting at his men to dismount and help clear the log. Roan and Hester stood side by side in the slush, watching the men scramble in the mud, humiliated and broken. Roan looked down at the paper lying in the muck. He stooped, picked it up, and wiped the mud off the seal. He handed it to Hester. She took it, her raw, scarred hands brushing against his rough, calloused fingers. The touch lingered just for a heartbeat. It was a silent, heavy weight passing between them. "Roof still needs patching," Roan muttered, breaking the silence as they watched the men hack frantically at the pine tree. Hester folded the paper and slipped it into her canvas coat. A faint, almost imperceptible ghost of a smile touched the corner of her cracked lips. "Sun's out," she said. "Better get to it." If you felt the chill of that winter and loved seeing Hester and Roan finally put Taggart in his place, smash that like button and subscribe. This isn't your typical dusty romance. It's about grit, survival, and the quiet power of finding your equal. What was your favorite moment? Drop a comment below and let us know. Don't forget to share this video with fellow Western fans, and ring the bell so you never miss our next grounded, raw story.